Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. This has been a day of new ideas for me, a very bold proposals by people, and I'm going to put forward also a fairly bold proposal that has local implications, as Sally had mentioned, but also global implications. I first want to acknowledge my co-authors, Brian and Frank, at the USGS in Sacramento, and also point out that this data that I'll be showing spans a very large group of people I've worked with in the field, and also people that meet in workshops like this, where we try to focus on negative emissions from wetlands and how we can document that as well as potentially manage that. Not all parts of the world are equally efficient at storing carbon. Wetlands are superb at storing carbon. That's what they do. So almost by definition, they are CO2 sinks. So you get a negative emission because the carbon gets stored below ground. That could be produced in place or deposited. But the point is, it's under a water column. There's low oxygen. Therefore, this carbon gets stored as reduced carbon in the soil. The problem, again, of that reduced soil is that you can then have other metabolic products such as methane and nitrous oxide, and it's those factors that really potentially change a wetland from being a net sink of carbon to a net source. So I'm going to talk basically about some restoration and management options that we've looked at in a couple different systems. Just want to point out again, wetlands are really important at the global scale, whether it's a natural wetland or rice, which is a growing part of it. 40% of the global methane emissions are coming from wetlands. We think that's actually increasing over time. When people think of wetlands, they tend to think of these boreal sites, which are not, certainly not unimportant. They're the dominant current pool, and they are changing through time with increased temperatures. But in addition, there's a really wide range variety of wetlands within this temperate and tropical zone. They cover everything from the Indonesian peatlands, the swamplands that Sarah mentioned earlier today, to the vast salt marshes of the east coast of the US. There's just a great variety. And those temperate and tropical zones, while there's not as much landmass of them, they are really important for CO2 uptake, again, very productive systems, but also potentially for methane production. This study came out a couple years ago in Science, and what it shows is a scaled up version of what the net flux of methane would look like from a wetland within one of these cells. These are 3-degree squared cells of the world, and you can see that the real hot spots where you get a lot of methane produced is in these tropical regions here, temperate and tropical zones, and that is what people are watching very closely in terms of determining whether wetlands are going to be performing as a net sink or a net source. These systems are prone to shift into that category very quickly because of this methane. I want to point out that that model was based on water and temperature, water depth changes and temperature changes, but there's another big change going on, which is rising CO2. This study again came out last year, and it showed from a meta-analysis of many, many carbon enrichment studies that when enhanced CO2 is supplied to particularly wetlands, but other systems as well, you get a bump up in the production of methane and nitrous oxide. And if you take this to the global scale, it could lead to an estimated increase of these greenhouse gases of about a petagram per year. So this potentially could be very important, and about half of that's coming from stimulated production of these greenhouse gases in wetlands, whether they're natural wetlands or rice paddies. So again, we know that wetlands store a lot of carbon in a very small area. Here, the wetland acreage versus other acreages. Not only that, it's stored mostly in the soil. So, and these soil carbon stocks are similar to what you might find in a tropical forest carbon soil stock. The reason this is important that it's in the soil is that in systems where the water level is rising, such as coastal systems or any system that's driven by drainage where that water table is rising, that carbon locked in the soil is potentially there forever. Could be. We have large peat deposits throughout the world showing that carbon can be stored in those systems. The problem, again, with all this carbon being stored in the soil is that we have this greenhouse gas production, and it's possible that we have a very hard time modeling it. So it's very hard for us to actually put a number on true carbon sequestration when you take into account the greenhouse gas emissions. So why are wetlands so hard to model? They're extremely dynamic systems. You have a coupled above ground and below ground system. It's very difficult. There's 3 ways of methane production, 2 pathways of oxidation. There's landscape variability within wetlands, drainage channels, ditches versus crowns, hummocks, very different stories. You also have the surrounding landscape playing a role in what happens in a particular wetland. Salinity variability is important. We know now that if you're above about half strength seawater, if you have a lot of seawater in the system, you tend to not produce methane. Below that number, below that concentration, the numbers get really variable, very hard to model. We know that it really matters what kind of plants you have there. People have shown that parenchyma, the pipes through plants, can be very important pathways for methane to leave systems. So that matters. And then ultimately, it's this lack of steady state conditions. Most models, DayCent, DNDC, ones that we've used, really like to drive in a linear fashion towards different redox patterns. And what we have is a hard time looking at true labile carbon turnover in these systems. We have coupled oxic and anoxic processes. We're talking about nitrification plus denitrification, the Ferris wheel, the cycling of iron through its redox states. And another one is humic electron acceptors. This is something that's come out recently, and it really is very difficult to model within the current process-based models that we are using. And ultimately, again, the production of greenhouse gases doesn't mean it's going to get emitted. There's a couple sink terms for greenhouse gases that we need to we have to consider. However, we need these models. We need them very badly because they are part of the decision making and for monitoring if we were to move towards a carbon credit system to take account of that carbon that's being stored in wetlands. So I'm going to talk about a local system I know some of you are probably familiar with, but this is a schematic of the Delta. It's about 100 miles east of here. It's one of the largest peat deposits in the US. And what this area shows is about a 500,000 acre area that was formed with the rising sea level over the last 18,000 years. They're about 7,000 years old, and since the gold rush, we've lost about half the peat. There's a big bowl out there now. It's extremely deep, and it released about a teragram of carbon over those last 150 years. We estimate that if things continue, it will just get to be a bigger bowl, and we'll have even more carbon coming out of this system. We manage it right now for agriculture still. It's a $1 billion agricultural industry. And we also manage it for freshwater conveyance because the waters from the northern parts of California flow through the Delta and then south to California. It's about half the state's drinking water. If salinity came into here, which sea level rise is pushing every day against this zone, if seawater came into here, it would salinize the system. Bad for agriculture, bad for drinking water. It's a big problem. So given that problem, we were funded by the Department of Water Resources to look at the ability to build peat back up, fill up that bowl, and take some pressure off the levees. Through doing that, we found very quickly that, oh yes, we could grow that peat really quickly. So this is proto-peat. This isn't a true peat, but we can grow this much faster than typical sea level rise rates, driven rates. Basically, we had 2 ponds. One was about 2 feet deep, one about 1 foot deep. And what we saw was that we could grow this at about 2 inches per year. And what we found particularly interesting is that it stores a ton of carbon. There's just about a kilogram of carbon per meter squared in the soil per year. So we're basically rivaling Amazon rainforests in the sequestration rates. And again, it's below ground. Someday, when this is back up to actual sea level, we would be able to reconnect this, and this would become a buried peat deposit. That would be our goal. So again, that was a CO2 budget, and clearly it's net negative, so net uptake of CO2 into the system. But to do a full accounting of greenhouse gases, we need to look at both methane and nitrous oxide, how much is, what's the balance within the wetland itself, and then compare it to those neighboring cornfields, for example, and see what would be the net benefit of a land use conversion to this other system. We have a hard time, again, modeling methane because of all of those factors that make it difficult. But one thing that was promising is that there's a very strong relationship between productivity and methane flux. So this is saying that the more production you have, the more methane should be released. In our system, that, of course, gave us pause because we have such high productivity in the system. You would think there'd be humongous methane fluxes coming out. And now I'll present you some data that show that it's not as bad as we thought, which is, again, makes this become more of a correlation question and not a causation. The processes involved here are difficult to tease out, and that's what we're trying to do right now. Again, with methane, the presence of plants can do two things. One, that could stimulate the oxidation of methane in the rhizosphere because a plant transfers oxygen through its parenchyma, or it could also pipe that methane out, that shunt species concept. The ebullition of methane is a difficult term to model. It's a very stochastic process, and diffusion is less likely, but it is also happening through the water column. All right, I'm going to just show you some data from Robin Miller's earlier work. She did a lot of gas flux numbers from chambers on the wetland back in 2003. And what she was able to show was that very, very high rates of carbon sequestration are happening. She put chambers over the entire plants, not just looking at the soil, and saw these high rates. And then if she took her maximum methane fluxes from those same time periods, she just measured about noon every day, it compensates, if you just scale that up to a full day, 24 hours of that worst case scenario, it really still only offset the CO2 emissions by about 2/3. So it wasn't a deal breaker having that methane coming out. In one of the wetlands, or the deeper wetland, we saw that actually turned the system into a neutral category. So based on her data, we decided to focus on the west wetland for our work in the past couple years, where we're looking at scaling this up to a demonstration project. Over the last 2 years, we've been focusing on monitoring methane flux and CO2 flux throughout the west pond with an eddy covariance system, where basically you use eddies of air coupled with concentrations of CO2 and methane to estimate how much is going up and how much is going down. We use static chambers, and we put those at, we have 2 eddy covariance towers. We put the static chambers at A, B, and C, which are basically near the inlet, more middle, and here in this more interior site, because the water really flows from the inlet to the outlet, and this area becomes more of a backwater site. So we looked at static chambers, again, huge 14-foot chambers. Then we also did a lot of leaf photosynthesis work to get at gross primary productivity and also respiration. And we did that pretty much everywhere, looked at multiple species. So I'm just going to run through the data really quickly. I don't have a lot of time for data, but I want to point out a couple of things. The daily cycle of CO2 is just what you'd expect. Respiration at night, and then an uptake of CO2 during the day, respiration, photosynthesis, respiration. And if you look at this over the full year, you can see that the plants really kick in about July through September. That's when we get these high rates of uptake. And what's really important here is that we have very low nighttime respiration. These are some of the lowest numbers that I've seen. I just went to a wetlands conference. These were remarkably low. But that's what we're finding is basically in the about 3 micromoles per meter squared per second range, and it's continuous through the year. The other thing we found out is that these values really change between years. So in the East Pond, we had a tower there for 2 years. And we found is that basically in 2011, it's shown here in blue, it's pretty similar to the West Pond, about similar uptake rates. But in 2010, it was a very dead year. We had half the CO2 uptake. And that was also a year we had a lot of thatch and dead stuff out there. So there's this boom and bust cycle in these wetlands, again, making it difficult from a monitoring and modeling perspective. I will say from the methane flux perspective, we had a diurnal signal as well. So again, higher fluxes of methane during the day than at night. And we also saw that methane was, of course, higher in the summer than it was in the winter. But in terms of interannual variability, not a lot, just pretty much similar between years. This isn't a fair comparison, 2 different sites, but they're fairly equal, and we didn't see much of a difference there. So if we combine these two, you can see that if you did this land use conversion, you'd still end up with a net negative system. The global warming potential for just last year is basically the CO2 uptake, here shown in blue, compensated for by the methane uptake, here changed into CO2 equivalent. And you can see here the global warming potential still comes out to be net negative at about minus 3.5. When you couple that with the loss of oxidation of the peat and loss of nitrous oxide emissions from those cornfields, you end up getting, again, a fairly strong case for net negative system. I want to point out again, though, that this variability is really important between years. This is that 2010 year that was fairly dead. These are the kind of the glory days of our marsh. This is 2003. We had very, very high rates of uptake, and we think that we need management to keep that going. We haven't been keeping the water levels where they need to be, and we haven't been lodging the dead vegetation or pushing it down under just to get rid of it. So this is an end member situation. This is, again, a fairly dead marsh. Yellow is showing more thatch. And this is what we had last year, more blues, more green vegetation showing up in the site. So in terms of spatial variability, we again saw that the inlet was our winner of a site. That was the site we had the most uptake during the August time period when we did this very focused 96 hours of flux data. We did this with continuous CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide instrumentation out in the field at all 3 stations for 96 hours. This is an incredibly useful data set that overall shows that A is our winner site, limited methane flux, high CO2 uptake. And also shows that we actually had not a similar pattern. NPP did not drive methane release in this site. So we think there's something else going on. NPP, the productivity was not the real driver here. I won't go through this, but I will say that we saw that even with these large chambers and with massive fans turning over the air, we saw that chamber effects kicked in within 1 minute. So we saw higher rates than a typical study would have shown because we had the continuous data density. We also had the ability to separate diffusive flux from ebullition, these bubble events that came through. And while we showed with diffusion, we have clearly some sort of diurnal patterns for some sites, not at site A, I'll note. We had ebullition events that were actually fairly significant. So up to about 1/3 of the methane seemed to be coming up through these bubbles. Last thing I want to show is the nitrous oxide data. These systems are not only not net sources of methane, of N2O, there's evidence of uptake of nitrous oxide in these sites. A lot of people that do chamber work do not put them over the full plants. Some of the thoughts are that this N2O is being taken up through plant stomates, and this is an area obviously needs further research. What is driving then that spatial variability? Might have been the biomass, again, much higher at site A. Could have been the type of species. This is Thule, Schenoplectus acutus, hard-stem bulrush. It is one of the biggest angiosperms on the planet, non-woody, and it is very lignaceous and has lots of parenchyma. Sorry, and I will back up and say that the 2 big drivers everybody looks to, water depth and temperature, not a story. We don't think those were the drivers in this system. In terms of spatial variability, again, we have this hydrology gradient, and we saw that it did affect the electron acceptors. So we see basically evidence of iron reduction in these back areas, in these interior sites, but not so much at the inlet sites. Same is true for sulfate reduction. And we have this beautiful relationship with sulfate and sulfide showing that they're anti-correlated. And then importantly, with acetate, an index of fermentation, we saw that there was no a real pattern there. And also these values were fairly low for a system that should have been so carbon rich. I won't spend much time on this, but Susanna Tringe at the Department of Energy has done a great deal of metagenomic work out there and shown very clearly that the presence of methanogens are associated with those backwater sites, those interior sites. And those sites are also anti-correlated with nitrate reduction, sulfate reduction genes. So again, the shift in populations of microbial communities appears important. So what can we really say? This inlet site, those are the kind of sites we want to make, just like with any industrial system. We want to optimize, and we want to start making sites that look like that. We think that we can explain why, based on the microbial communities, or what made that site particularly good. We saw that there was no correlation between productivity and methane. It was negatively correlated, actually. And then we also saw that nitrous oxide was consumed. Finally, the reason that so much carbon is stored at this site is probably because the plants are incredibly good at hanging on to the carbon that they do fix, and they allocate quite a bit to below ground biomass. And probably more importantly, the system has warm days, cold nights, basically from 30 degrees Celsius in the day to 10 degrees Celsius at night. That means good photosynthesis in the day, low respiration at night, really good conditions for storing carbon. Ultimately, we know that we can manage this system better, and that is what we're proposing that people consider in other systems that have lost peat and are looking to rebuild that peat. A managed system that targets peat accretion and then also get the carbon benefits out of it. I will mention that trace gas methods are really improving for the FluxNet or Eddy Covariance towers around the world. About 20% of them now have methane data because the improvements in that monitoring technology have made that possible. And finally, I just want to point out that if you look for organic soils on the planet, there are still quite a bit of them. They're in this temperate and tropical zone that are old peatlands that may be amenable to restoration. And probably more importantly, we should be looking at avoided loss of these deep wetland, these deep peat systems. And with that, I'll just close by saying wetlands can be managed. We do manage them for wildlife, rice, many food, fiber, fuel issues. And I think that we can start including greenhouse gas management into that portfolio. Thanks.
Okay, questions?
What is a typical restoration procedure? Can you inform? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, sure. So ultimately, we're talking, in this place, an extreme restoration, a very bold move. The idea of basically flooding a site to about a foot deep and walling it off and allowing that peat to grow back into that pond, if you will. So basically creating a big accommodation space that you allow peat to grow into. But there's a lot of different wetland restorations that would promote carbon sequestration and peat growth. That's just one of them.
Okay, back over there.
Yeah, what uncertainty do you associate with the potential future land use changes in these wetlands that are going to sequester the carbon dioxide?
The ones here or globally?
Either.
Globally, avoided loss is the biggest issue. I mean, pretty much all of these deep soils are subject to drainage, and they're great soils for agriculture in particular, and rice. So that's the direction things are going. For the Delta here, for example, it's a very mixed sense of what to do because they are basically all below sea level. And so basically the California State Water Project that moves water uses 3% of the energy budget of California to move water. It is the biggest electricity consumer. And that's not sustainable. So they need to find a way to make those islands be a little bit more, come into a better carbon balance from an energy perspective. And also the water moving into the delta is likely to turn saline at some point, and then you couldn't farm there anyway. So there's a lot of issues. I don't know exactly how things will roll.
I have a question. Yeah. So number one, the amount of carbon that's stored is stunningly large. I think it was like 3.5 million tons per hectare per year. It was one of the
Oh,
numbers.
metric tons.
Oh, metric tons.
Sorry,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, all right, metric tons, okay. I was thinking, wow, that is like awesome.
Not that good, yeah.
So have you thought about the interaction between sea level rise and how much, more, wetlands might be created with sea level rise and how that might impact carbon balances?
So the only way that sea level rise can increase carbon sequestration in wetlands is if we allow them to migrate landward. And the problem at this point is that, like for example, San Francisco Bay, there's only 2 places in the bay that are not levied, not boundaried, that have an ecotone you can move into. Globally, it's worse, it's getting worse because of coastal development. So where there can be migration, there's great potential. Huge peat deposits in North Carolina that are still there and could continue to be buried as sea level rises.
Okay, more questions? We've got one up here. Oh, you got one. Okay, we'll do you, and then we'll do you, then we'll take a break.
I was just going to ask, how site-specific do you think your results are? How sensitive is it to various parameters, salinity, or other site-specific characteristics?
Well, those are the questions that we really have. So we want to test those questions. In this demonstration project, we thought we would fool around with all kinds of treatments and look at that. But this is going to be implemented in Florida and Louisiana at very small scales. There's a couple of places in the Delta that are also looking, well, they're prospective places that are theoretically moving forward. But the point is, I do worry that you won't see these crazy high rates that we get here in other sites, primarily because of nighttime respiration rates potentially and any species changes. But you still might get significant growth of peat in those systems. So somebody needs to test it.
Okay, one more question. Yep.
You mentioned that salt marshes and saline wetlands don't produce methane. Are they also very productive in terms of building, storing carbon, and what would be the potential for creating artificial or increasing the number of salt marshes as a sequestration option?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure about creating artificial. I'm not sure exactly how that would be done. It takes a special sort of environment, low energy environment for them to develop. But in terms of their sequestration, they're one of the winner systems right now in terms of the Blue Carbon Initiative. It's a new quantification system for coastal ecosystems. Because of that lack of methane release, their estimates can be anywhere from 100 to 300 grams per meter squared. And so that's about 1/3 or 1/10 to 1/3 of what we're seeing here. But in this system, but there's no methane. So it's actually a particularly good avenue to be pushed forward. It's actually going to be part of the new IPCC 2015 supplement, wetland supplement. So we'll see.
Okay, well, it's time for a break, so let's thank our speaker. Yeah.